This is Donald J. Trump, the President of the United States. Trump campaigned on shrinking the federal government and attacking waste and fraud. So on January 27th, the Office of Management and Budget sent a memo to the heads of all executive departments and agencies. The memo called for a temporary pause of agency grant, loan, and other financial assistance programs. This temporary pause will provide the administration time to review agency programs and determine the best uses of the funding for those programs, consistent with the law and the president's priorities. And many of those priorities were handed down by executive orders like reevaluating and realigning United States foreign aid and ending radical and wasteful government DEI programs and preferencing. Federal agencies must temporarily pause all activities related to obligation or disbursement of all federal financial assistance and other relevant agency activities that may be implicated by the executive orders. This would include, but not be limited to, financial assistance for foreign aid, NGOs, DEI, woke gender ideology, and the Green New Deal. But Democrats jumped on these four words, all federal financial assistance, and claimed that Trump was going to end your Medicare and Social Security, even though the memo states that this did not include assistance provided directly to individuals, and nothing in this memo should be construed to impact Medicare or Social Security benefits. So the next day, Democracy Forward, a left-leaning group, filed a complaint with the U.S. District Court for the District of Columbia. A federal judge then temporarily blocked the order, and the OMB rescinded the memo. But then the next day, 22 attorneys general, all Democrats, filed a request for an emergency temporary restraining order, claiming that the OMB memo was violating the Administrative Procedure Act. The OMB directive appears to require the temporary suspension of disbursement and obligation of all federal financial assistance with few exceptions. And instead of waiting to see what programs were actually affected, the Democrats went with hypotheticals, claiming that the OMB order could potentially affect anything and everything, including Medicaid reimbursements, FEMA funds for disaster relief and management, the National School Lunch Program, child support enforcement, veterans nursing care funding, and hundreds or thousands of other programs, covering everything from immunizations to clean water to adoption assistance to transit to childcare to global AIDS prevention to National Guard operations to crime victim assistance to immigration and refugee assistance to wildlife restoration, and on and on. So of course, John J. McConnell Jr., an Obama-appointed judge for the U.S. District Court of the District of Rhode Island, issued a temporary restraining order, even though the OMB memo had already been rescinded. And that should have been the end of it while the Trump administration appealed the decision, but instead, the Democrats proceeded to file an emergency motion, claiming there was evidence that Trump was defying the order, and Judge McConnell agreed, because of course he did. In response, Vice President J.D. Vance posted the following on X. If a judge tried to tell a general how to conduct a military operation, that would be illegal. If a judge tried to command the Attorney General in how to use her discretion as a prosecutor, that's also illegal. Judges aren't allowed to control the executive's legitimate power. And despite the use of the word legitimate, Democrats falsely claimed that Vice President Vance's post was a thinly veiled threat that the Trump administration would start defying the court. And you all know what that means.
Warnings tonight of a constitutional crisis brewing. The U.S. is dangerously close to a constitutional crisis.
That's right. It's time for another Trump hoax. I know you're shocked.
And legal scholars say we are headed for a constitutional crisis.
Legal experts warning of an impending constitutional crisis.
Some Democrats and legal experts say it leaves us smack dab in the middle of what they're calling a constitutional crisis.
If he intends to ignore what the courts say, this country will potentially find ourselves in a constitutional crisis.
So if the president, if the vice president, if others in the administration say we're just not going to listen to what the judicial branch says, that is a constitutional crisis. That is a crisis for our democracy. This is how democracies crumble and how dictators win in the end.
The most serious constitutional crisis, arguably of the last 100 years.
There's some debates unfolding right now about what exactly would qualify as a constitutional crisis. Are we in one? Seems to me we've been one for a long time, certainly since the aftermath of the 2020 election.
Constitutional law experts say this is the clearest sign that we might be creeping towards a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, I think most Democrats believe it's a constitutional crisis.
Basically, we're in a constitutional crisis, even though there isn't a complete, clear definition.
It's a constitutional crisis. We are seeing an executive branch that has decided that they are no longer going to abide by the Constitution.
It is threatening the Constitution itself, hence a constitutional crisis.
A lot of critics of this White House suggest that they are on the cusp of a constitutional crisis.
Democrats have looked at this and see a potential constitutional crisis on the horizon.
We are at a point where we are basically on the cusp of a constitutional crisis, seeing this administration taking steps that are so clearly illegal.
We've got what experts are calling a real constitutional crisis.
The constitutional crisis, I believe we are in one.
The constitutional crisis here is that Congress has been subverted.
A constitutional crisis, grossly unconstitutional.
Yeah, listen, I think this is the most serious constitutional crisis the country has faced.
Do you think we're heading towards a constitutional crisis right now?
Yeah, I do believe that.
All of this is a constitutional crisis. We're watching this unfold over time. And I don't mean to be hyperbolic about this or to be on 11 all of the time, but is a constitutional crisis.
New warnings of a constitutional crisis.
Yeah, listen, this isn't hyperbole to say that we are staring the death of democracy in the eyes right now.
We are hearing the phrase constitutional crisis. Will the president drive the nation full steam ahead into a constitutional crisis? There have been so many unconstitutional and illegal actions in the first 18 days of the Trump presidency. We've never seen anything like this. Democrats to keep calling it a crisis, a constitutional crisis.
You really do have a constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
The constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis. The constitutional crisis.
A constitutional crisis.
That is a genuine constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
A constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Maybe headed for a constitutional crisis.
Constitutional crisis.
Is this a constitutional crisis?
Spoiler alert, no it's not. But some Democrats, like former White House press secretary Jen Psaki, are worried that saying constitutional crisis over and over again might not be working with the American people.
You know, there's this whole question of, is it a constitutional crisis? Yes, it is, if Elon Musk and Donald Trump are ignoring and trying to supersede what courts are doing. But we can't just keep saying constitutional crisis, constitutional crisis. Nobody knows exactly what that means. I mean, some people do. What does that mean to people sitting at home?
It means very little. Most people understand that the Democrats don't control the House or the Senate, and that their only recourse is to take the Trump administration to court over and over and over again. And when they get really desperate, they'll accuse Trump of violating a judge's order or something, even if it wasn't true.
If a judge does block one of your policies, part of your agenda, will you abide by that ruling? Will you comply?
Well, I always abide by the courts, and then I'll have to appeal it. But then what he's done is he's slowed down the momentum. I always abide by the courts, always abide by them, and will appeal.
And that pretty much killed the constitutional crisis narrative.
We obviously heard Trump say he would abide by the judge's orders, which is good news. At the top of the show, we said they were hinting about ignoring them, and now we have President Trump saying no, we would abide them. So constitutional crisis averted for now.
Constitutional crisis averted for now, but there's always next week, right, Jake? Anyway, that's it for now. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you next time, if there is a next time.